PilotsCub. The Mississippi ranks with the great rivers of the world, the Amazon, Nile, Ganges, Tigris, and Euphrates, Yangtze, Congo, Volga, Danube, Rio Grande, Orinoco, and St. Lawrence. Today it is the American river, but this claim to ownership on our part is fairly recent. The Mississippi belonged first to the Indians, then the French, and partially to the Spanish. The Indians used the river extensively. Coronado, the Spanish explorer who was looking for the legendary city of gold, El Dorado, heard much about the Mississippi from Indians during his explorations in 1541. De Soto, another Spanish adventurer who had been hunting gold in Florida, actually came upon the river as his explorations expanded westward. He is considered its discoverer, although he explored only the lower portion of the river. De Soto himself died on its shore, and his body was sunk in the Mississippi waters to prevent Indians from finding it and desecrating it. For 132 years after De Soto's discovery, there is no further record of white men on the river. Then in 1673, two Frenchmen, Joliet and Marquette, reached the Mississippi by the way of the Great Lakes and the Wisconsin River. They were probably the first white men on the upper course of the river. In 1682, La Salle, another French explorer, followed the Mississippi from what is now Illinois to the river's mouth and claimed all the surrounding territory in the name of the King of France, Louis XIV. La Salle named the area Louisiana after the king. In 1684, he returned from France to found a colony at the mouth of the Mississippi, but he was killed by one of his own men. In 1718, Bienville founded New Orleans and extended the French North American Empire from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. Thus, in the 18th century, the Mississippi was a French river, and the extensive lands around the river were French. In 1762, by the Treaty of Paris, the Mississippi Valley east of the river, except for the site of New Orleans, was transferred from France to Spain, while the remainder of the valley was secretly ceded to Spain. Spanish control was a problem to the farmers of the then United States West, especially Kentucky and Tennessee, and the treaty conditions for use of the Mississippi were a source of international wrangling. The early white settlers of the Mississippi Valley found the river a good way to get their merchandise from inland to the sea. Using the river was cheaper than carrying loads across the mountains. Once the products were in New Orleans, they could easily be transferred by boat to the South Atlantic states, New York or New England. To these settlers, Spanish control of both sides of the river at New Orleans was a continual annoyance. However, in 1795, Spain signed a 3-year treaty allowing the United States to sail their ships on the Mississippi River and to use New Orleans as a free port. At the end of the 3 years, the Spanish governor refused to allow United States ships into New Orleans, again cutting the Mississippi River from the United States for the practical purpose of moving goods. By 1800s, Spanish rule had come to an end. Louisiana was given back to France. The settlements in the American territories, particularly those west of the Allegheny Mountains, felt strongly about closing the river. President Jefferson recognized that he had a difficulty problem to deal with and that the settlers' tempers were at a dangerous pitch. Jefferson authorized Robert Livingston to try to negotiate a treaty with Napoleon for purchasing enough land to secure United States control of the Mississippi and its outlet. Livingston went even further with Jefferson's plan. In 1803, Livingston brought off the Louisiana Purchase. At one stroke, the entire territory was annexed to America and the Mississippi became an American river. Early traffic on Mississippi was practically all one way. Barges and keelboats could float down the river easily enough, but the return trip back up the river was rarely attempted. Although the voyage down went swiftly, the trip back by boat was next to impossible since the boats had to be poled by hand. A round trip could take as long as 9 months. Immigration into the Mississippi Valley after the Louisiana Purchase would have been slow and difficult had it not been for the introduction of the steamboat. The steamboat was developed just a few years after the transfer of ownership of the river and its surrounding lands to the United States. Robert Fulton, generally credited with inventing the steamboat, made a voyage in 1807 on the Hudson River between New York and Albany. Fulton was not the first man to build a steamboat, but he was the first to get one running successfully in American waters. 4 years after Fulton's memorable journey up the Hudson River to Albany, the first steamboat came puffing down the Mississippi. Because of the steamboat, the Mississippi had at last become a means of quick communication and of greatly increased trade. Families who were separated could travel back and forth on visits, traveling shows could journey from town to town, and businessmen could make excursions up and down the river. New Orleans rapidly became one of the most important ports in the New World. After 1830, the river steamer was an essential gay, romantic part of American life, and the vessels became more and more fancy as trade became more and more lucrative. The outside of the boat, the gaudy in the extreme, the inside was the last word in comfort. Each stateroom had 2 bunks made up neatly and cozily. There was a closet in which to hang clothes and a looking glass where the dandies who travelled up and down the river could admire themselves. The walls of gilded saloons were covered with oil paintings. There were thick carpets underfoot and sparkling chandeliers overhead. On every boat there were gamblers in kid gloves, shiny boots, tall silk hats, diamond stick pins, and the latest fashion of elegantly cut English suits. Their sweethearts paraded about in feathers and finery, bows and silver buckles, loops of pearls and high hats crowned with gorgeous peacock feathers. Meanwhile, the valley itself was being populated by the kind of people who had little traffic with gamblers. The settlers were suspicious of over refinement and the latest styles. They believed in hard work, Christian duty, and self denial. The Mississippi Valley people were also hardy, self reliant, and prone to judge a man by his actions, not his background. They looked askance at the fancy East, at the idea of first families and Mayflower descendants, and at an over-cultured voice and an overstocked mind. This valley was to produce people who gave us much of the basis of our American democracy as we know it today. The pioneer creed that a man was a man when he had proved it, and not because his father made money. Judge no one on family or wealth or social connections was the cry. Judge a man on his own merit. The steamboat, with its ready access to the communities along the river, rapidly spread the spirit of the new age. But the great period of the steamboat was to last scarcely more than 50 years. The Civil War brought an end to regular steamboat service, and after the war, the Mississippi was never the same. Although many of the steamboats resumed their old routes, railroads had been greatly expanded north and south, east and west. With the coming of railroads, the old river ports were to molder slowly away. It is impossible to overstate the contribution that the steamboat, in its brief 50 odd years of activity, made in the development of American life. But for the coming of the steamboat, the development of the valley would probably have been postponed at least a generation until the coming of the iron horse. The keelboats continued to take wares downstream for 15 or 20 years after the advent of the steamboat, but steamers handled all the upstream business. Keelboats carried the cargo to New Orleans, and there the boats were sold and their owners returned upstream by steamboat. In Sam Clemens' youth, the boys used to swim out to the floating keelboats and hitch a ride for a mile or so downstream. The keelboatmen were a rough crew with all yarns and rude manners, but they were basically friendly and they were usually kind to the boys. When young Sam Clemens started off for New Orleans to get a boat to the Amazon, he saw the steamboat in all the glory of its heyday. In later years, he described the sight of the boat, long and sharp and trim and pretty, two tall, fancy topped chimneys with a gilded device of some kind swung between them, a fanciful pilot house, all glass and gingerbread. The paddle boxes are gorgeous, with a picture or with gilded rays above the boat's name. The boiler deck, the hurricane deck, and the Texas deck are fenced and ornamented with clean white railings. Happy and excited as Sam was at the thought of his coming explorations in South America, he had not lost any of the fascination that he felt for the river pilot, nor any of the awe he experienced when he heard the heady talk that went on in the pilot house. In no time or at all, Sam had gone up to the pilot house and made friends with Horace Bixby, who was one of the pilots on the boat he was taking to New Orleans. Soon he was spending all his waking hours chattering with the famous pilot. Bixby even let the boy steer some of the time during daylight and in the easy sections of the river. Had Sam not been going to the Amazon, he would have liked to be river pilot, he thought, and he confided his dreams and the excitement of his coming adventure to Bixby. He talked about the Amazon, about life on the Mississippi at Hannibal, about how he wanted to do something different and exciting from the way of life he had known. But Sam was destined never to see the Amazon. In New Orleans, he discovered there was no boat leaving for the Amazon for at least 3 or 4 years, maybe 10 or 12, some said. Others told him there was never going to be a boat. Sam went to a Horace Bixby and related this staggering disappointment. All the way down the Mississippi, Sam had been bragging about how he would be afloat on the Amazon, and now he had to admit his dreams were nothing but pipe dreams. Bixby listened sympathetically, and then suddenly he realized what Sam was leading up to. Sam had his heart set on being a pilot somewhere. He wanted to master the Mississippi if he couldn't master the Amazon. Finally, Bixby agreed to take him as a cub on the Paul Jones and teach him the art of piloting for the sum of $500. Sam had no money of his own to speak of, but he borrowed $100 from Pamela's husband and made a deal with Bixby to pay him the other $400 when he became a licensed pilot and was earning money. Sam had absolutely no idea what he was getting into. In the first place, Bixby was not what might be called an easy teacher. He lost his patience quickly, and he had a sharp tongue. Bixby saw the ignorance of his young pilot often as stupidity and didn't hesitate to say so. But what started as abuse gradually turned to patience and understanding. Gradually, Sam began through the filter of Bixby's colorful language to learn the tortuous windings of the Mississippi. For it was not Bixby's temper or impatience or astonishing vocabulary that really bothered Sam, but the size of the job in front of him. When he had signed on, he had had no notion of the difficulties the job presented. The Mississippi River is some 2,000 miles long. It is the crookedest river in the world. The river is constantly shifting. Islands become peninsulas. Peninsulas become islands. Slight bands become in time long meanders. The and these in turn become abundant river channels with crescent-shaped lakes as the river again cuts across a peninsula. The Mississippi can also make prodigious jumps across itself, cutting through a narrow neck of land. Often the river shortens its previous route by taking a jump of 30 miles at one time. Consequently, the distance up and down the river is continually changing. If the river were 200 miles from one place to another and took a 30-mile shortcut, and distance would change to 170 miles. Sometimes the cut-offs change boundaries, and in the old times, a cut-off could transfer a slave from a slave state of Missouri to the free one of the Illinois, thus making a free man of him. The river also occasionally moved sideways at hard times. Louisiana, for instance, Sam Clemens later wrote that the river in his time was 2 miles west of its original bed. As a result, the town was no longer in Louisiana but was now in the state of Mississippi. In its constant flow southward, the Mississippi in some places built up natural embankments or levees along the shore. These natural levees are higher than the remainder of the flood plain. Often the bed of the river actually was higher than the surrounding country. The natural levees were supplemented by artificial levees to protect the countryside from floods. Sam's job was to learn every single thing that had happened, was happening, or might happen on the huge river. At this time, there was not one marker, not one lighthouse, and not a single buoy or bell to help a pilot guide his boat. In addition to a total lack of navigation aids, there were numerous snags, wrecks, shoals, reefs, and submerged trees that were a constant danger to steamboats. For example, a pilot would have to know the exact location of over 500 shoals, places he might meet during a trip between St. Louis and New Orleans. When the river was very low, it was necessary to sound the very shallow places. Sounding was done in the following manner. The steamboat pulled into shore just before the lost spot. The off-duty pilot, together with his cub and a crew of men, went out in a yawl to look for the best, that is, the deepest water for the steamboat to pass through. The pilot on the steamboat, meanwhile, watched the yawl through the spyglass. He would help the man on the yawl by signaling with the boat's whistle, for the surface of the water was often easier to judge from a distance than from close at hand. The pilot in yawl, meanwhile, took the depth of the water by means of a pole 10 or 12 feet long. He sounded the depth with the pole. Sometimes buoys were put out to mark the passage for the steamboat. The buoys were boards 4 or 5 feet long, with one end turned up at night. Paper lanterns with candles were fastened on top of the buoys. Often a leadsman stood at the front of the boat to test the depth of the water. As the boat proceeded slowly along the river, the leadsman let his line out to see how deep the water was. He would call out his findings. MARK3, MARK3, quarter less 3, half twain, quarter twain, MARK, twain, 8.5, EIGHT, feet, 7.5. Each fathom measured 6 feet. The sign Mark Twain meant a depth of 2 fathoms or 12 feet. The Paul Jones was a large boat and drew 9 feet. The cry of the leadsman echoed through Sam Clement's waking mind and haunted his dreams at night. He seemed to hear inside his head over and over, MARK, 7, deep 4, quarter less 3, MARK, twain. There were countless accidents on the river. Steamboats were constantly going around, exploding, splitting in two, sinking or burning. On Hat Island alone 29 boats had been lost. Another hazard were the numerous small boats, the scows, keelboat, and rafts that were freighting cargo downriver. The steamboat had to be careful not to run them down. Sam's first trip as a cub pilot was one of that he never forgot. When the steamboat pulled away from New Orleans, Bixby began pointing out landmarks along the way. The afternoon passed pleasantly, but Sam dozed and daydreamed during the first 4-hour watch. During the night watch, Bixby asked him what was the first point about the New Orleans. Sam had to admit he could not remember. Don't know? Bixby demanded. Sam began to grow uneasy. What's the name of the next point? Bixby asked. Again Sam couldn't answer. Well, Bixby said, disgusted. This beats anything. Tell me the name of any point or place I told you. Sam studied a while and decided that he could not remember one. Then Bixby's wrath boiled up and overflowed and scalded the boy. You are the stupidest dunderhead I ever saw or ever heard of. So help me, Moses. Bixby fumed. The idea of you being a pilot. You. Why you don't know enough to pilot a cow down a lane. Look here. What do you suppose I told you the names of those points for? Sam made the mistake of telling the truth. Well, to be entertaining, I thought When Bixby's wrath finally subsided, he said, as if already he had given the utmost hope that Sam would ever make a pilot. My boy, you must get a little memorandum book, and every time I tell you a thing, put it down right away. There's only one way to be a pilot, and that is to get this entire river by heart. You have to know it, just like A, B, C. Sam eventually had a notebook that fairly bristled with the names of towns, points, bar, islands, bands, riches, etc. But the information was to be found only in the notebook. He writes, none of it was in his head. Sam was in for more surprises. His first night on the boat, it was forcibly driven home to him that the boat ran day and night. He had no sooner turned in than he felt someone rudely shaking him. Get up, the voice said, and there was laughter from the dark. Ain't the new cup turned out yet? He is delicate, lightly. Give him some sugar in a rag and send for the chambermaid to sing Rock a Bye Baby to him. Then Bixby appeared. In a few seconds, Sam was flying up to the pilot house with some of his clothes on and the rest draped over his arm. It had never occurred to Sam Clemens that he would have to get up in the middle of the night and fuss with the boat, but he was on 4 hours, off 4 hours, on 4 hours, around the clock. Another thing Sam discovered was that it was not enough to know the river by day. A pilot had to be able to feel his way along by night. There were no searchlights for the steamboats in those days, and the pilot had to depend on his knowledge of the river to guide the boat safely. This meant that the pilot had to be absolutely sure of where he was going. One mistake and the boat might go around. Worse, it might sink and lose $250,000 of equipment and cargo as well as jeopardizing the lives of the passengers and crew. Sam studied and fretted over all the observations in his notebook and tried to memorize what he could on his off hours. At last he thought he had in his mind all the bands and points, islands and snacks, bars and wrecks, but he was in for another shock. My boy, said Bixby, you have got to know the shape of the river perfectly. It is all there is left to steer by on a very dark night. Sam could not understand how he could learn a shape. How do you follow a hall at home in the dark? Bixby asked. Because you know the shape of it. You can't see it. He told Sam that he would have to know the shape of the Mississippi River better than he knew the halls of his own home. Sam would have to know the river so well that he could follow the true channel, regardless of how the river appeared to his eyes. At night, the appearance of the river was deceptive. Bixby wanted his cub to learn to carry the shape of the river in his head and never mind the shape before his eyes. His eyes could deceive him, but he would still be able to steer by the shape of his mind. One day, when Sam was beginning to grow cocky about his knowledge, Bixby asked him if he was sure of a particular part of the river they were approaching. Why, I can run it with my eyes shut, Sam said confidently. How much water is there in it? Young Sam Clemens looked at Bixby. The next crossing was one of the safest on the river. The water was practically bottomless. Why, I couldn't get bottom there with a church steeple, he said. You think so, do you? Bixby said and disappeared. There had been something in Bixby's manner which was faintly alarming, as if he had a new piece of information he wasn't telling his cub. Sam began to feel uneasy, supposing the river had made one of its changes. Supposing he were to go down and the usual route and run the steamboat around, supposing any number of things. Still, he continued to steer the boat where he was sure the passage was safe. A moment later, he looked up and saw that the captain was on the hurricane deck. Shortly, he was joined by a clerk, then one passenger after another. In a few moments, there was a whole crowd of people staring ahead. Sam was now beyond wondering. He was sure there was something ahead that was bad, something he didn't know about. He could not stop the boat and wait for Bixby to return. He could send a messenger after him. That would be cowardice. He stood at the wheel, filled with uneasiness. At that instant, he heard the leadsman's voice cry out, DEEP4, Deep 4 in bottomless crossing. The terror of it took Sam's breath away. The leadsman's cries began to come faster. The water was getting shallower and shallower. MARK3. MARK3. Quarter less 3. Half twain. Quarter twain. Quarter twain. Mark Twain. As all was lost, the boat was about to run around. Sam was quaking from head to foot. He seized the speaking tube and hollered at the top of his lungs to the engineer. Oh, Ben, if you love me, back her. Quick, Ben, oh, back the immortal soul out of her. A great crescendo of sound broke in on him. It sounded to Sam like the first scraping of the boat on a reef. Then he realized what it was: laughter. Everyone was laughing at him. The door opened quietly and Bixby stepped into the pilot house. Didn't you know there was no bottom in that crossing? He asked. Yes, sir, I did, Sam said. Very well, then. You shouldn't have allowed me or anyone else to shake your confidence in that knowledge. Try to remember that. And another thing, when you get into a dangerous place, don't turn coward. That isn't going to help matters any. What Bixby had taught Sam was an invaluable lesson on the river or elsewhere. If you know a thing, believe in it and don't let anyone sway you.